My name is Jamie Goodrich, and I'm the director of the Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our first book launch of the semester and of this academic year. I think as many of you know, the virtual book launch program is intended to highlight ongoing conversations in the humanities and to celebrate the scholarship of Wayne State University faculty members. And we're delighted that our first book launch will be on Beth Fowler's excellent book, Rock and Roll, Desegregation Movements and Racism in the Post-Civil Rights Era, an Integrated Effort. And I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to John Anderson, who I should just say has been doing a wonderful job of coordinating these events and coordinating everything around the book launches, and really deserves a lot of applause for his role in making this a smooth and enjoyable process for everyone. And I will let him do the honors of introducing our speakers.
Great, thank you so much, Jamie. Appreciate that. And I will just say, as the chair of the Humanities Center Virtual Book Launch Committee here at Wayne State University, it is our pleasure to introduce both of our guests tonight for this book launch. Dr. Beth Fowler is Associate Professor of Teaching in the Irvin D. Reed Honors College here at Wayne State. She received her PhD from the Department of History at Wayne State and has taught many American and world history classes. Her dissertation, Deliver Me from the Days of Old, Rock and Roll Music and the Racial Attitudes of Teenagers During the American Civil Rights Movement, is a study of how rock and roll music and media coverage of civil rights protests converged to encourage support for the desegregation of public spaces and moderate racial equality among middle-class Black and white teenagers during the 50s and the 60s. Her research interests include popular culture and consumerism, the US Civil Rights Movement, youth culture, urban history, gender and sexuality, and 20th century US and African-American history. Just reading from the abstract for the book, just to kind of set the tone here, it reads, the rock and roll music that dominated airwaves across the country during the 50s and 60s is often described as a triumph for integration. Black and white musicians alike scored hits with young audiences from different racial groups, blending sonic traditions from R&B, country, and pop. Yet the centering of integration, as well as the supposition that democratic rights largely based in consumerism should be available to everyone regardless of race, has resulted in very distinct responses to both music and movement among Black and white listeners. This book traces these distinctions to determine the uncertain legacies of the civil rights movement and early rock and roll music in a supposedly post-civil rights era. Now, we are also joined tonight by Dr. Michael Bertrand, who will be moderating our book launch. Dr. Bertrand is a historian of the American South and the modern US at Tennessee State University. He's taught at the University of Memphis, Middle Tennessee State University, and the University of Mississippi, where he worked in the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. He co-founded and moderated H Southern Music and also served as music editor for the African American National Biography. He has appeared on PBS, Sky Arts, and History Channel documentaries produced by Henry Louis Gates, David Upshaw, Bruce Sinofsky, and Michael Rosenau, and is the author of Race, Rock, and Elvis, and currently is writing his manuscript or in editing process for remixing the master, reframing the story, the significance of rock and roll in Southern history. So from the Humanities Center, we just want to thank everybody for being here tonight. And with that, I will hand things over to our esteemed guests.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the efforts of the Humanities Center. Thank you so much in promoting my book this way. And thank you to everyone for joining us here today. And thank you to Michael for joining us. I've been a fan of your work for such a long time, and your work has been so useful to my own research, and I'm just so happy to talk with you today.
Oh, well, thank you, Beth. And I'm a very big fan of yours. I want to thank John and also Jamie for having this. Several years ago, I was actually introduced to your dissertation. And I was really all excited about that. And after reading your dissertation, I was even more excited. And then whenever your book came out, and so I think this is a great work, and it's really great to have somebody in the field Because as you know, we're very few actual historians in the field, and so this is really nice. But I want to ask you that if we're ready to get started with kind of getting the dialogue going, I wanted to ask you, even though it does seem as if history and popular music would seem to go together, they often do not in terms of professional historians. So I want to ask you, what actually brought you to studying both popular music, particularly rock and roll, and race relations, particularly the modern civil rights movement? How did you come to that, particularly since it didn't seem to be much on the radar, I think, for a very long time? And so I'm really interested in if you could kind of give us a little bit of background on that.
Right. No, thank you so much. Yeah, that's interesting because I've found, and I'm sure you've found as well, that maybe within the last 10 years or so, there's been increased scholarship on these intersections between pop culture and the civil rights movement, social movements, those kinds of things. But when I was in grad school, that was definitely not the case. I knew that when I was working on my master's degree, that I wanted to do something with regards to the civil rights movement. It was something I was always interested in. My family was somewhat involved. My mom saw Martin Luther King speak when she was young. It was just something that was always very important to me, and something that was instilled in me that it was something I wanted to know more about. How I actually thought of it in terms of popular culture is random. I was reading an issue of Rolling Stone, and it was talking about like Elvis as this monumental presence in rock and roll music. And there was this line that I will never forget, that he bridged the worlds of white and black music. And I just remember that line just hitting me like with such force, and just thinking like, is that true? Like, I was aware of the sort of critiques of Elvis Presley as someone who had stolen black music, black culture before, but this idea of bridging these two worlds, particularly because of when he became famous, that was something that really sort of lit a match under me. So I remember this. I started working on sort of a prospectus when I was in grad school working on my master's degree. And the professor who was overseeing was just sort of like, I don't think you're going to be able to find anything on that. And I was sort of dismayed. I still wanted to do something with regards to teenage culture in the 1950s. And I kept looking, and your book was actually I had to special order it, but it was one of the first examples of scholarship literally tying these two things together and making a very clear argument about how the music that was released during this period expressed a lot of the changing ideas around racial politics at the time, and reinforced them in certain ways, and challenged them in certain ways and didn't in others. And literally, I remember getting that prospectus back from my professor, and she was like, "Yeah, you I was wrong. You were correct," which was great. So yeah, that was something that I was interested in right from the start. That was what I wrote my master's degree in, and realized that I wanted to expand on it when I wrote my dissertation upon entering my doctoral program. The big difference is that when I first started working on this project, I think I was very wedded to this idea that, like, yes, the music does bring people together, does sort of evoke the goals of the civil rights movement. And I still think that that's true, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think that through my work over 7 years in my doctoral program, and then the additional 5 or 6 years it took me to write the book, I was able, thankfully, to be able to still to temper that argument a little bit, complicate it a little bit. But yeah, that's how I became interested in it. I'm really glad to see that a lot more historians are exploring these connections, but also scholars across different fields of the humanities. So yeah.
Okay, cool. Because I was wondering too if you had any with the it's really fascinating about with your mom and the civil rights movement. I take it you're from Detroit?
I am from Windsor, which is in
Okay.
Canada, and
Okay.
it's just outside Detroit. Yeah, so sort of.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, 'cause, I remember with I think King did some work with Motown, and then I think also Malcolm X came to Detroit and they
Yes.
recorded his speech as well. So yeah, no, the and so you mentioned that it's complicated.
Mhm.
Well, it is complicated, and do you think that um, um, why do you think historians particularly, why do you think historians might have avoided that particular complexity
Yeah.
in dealing with this?
Well, I think for a long time, the popular culture, and you may have encountered this as well, it wasn't taken very seriously in scholarly circles. I think that that's maybe a remnant of the Frankfurt School, which is that consumer culture is just sort of, it's just there to make money, and people are sort of brainwashed into purchasing purchasing music, listening to music, watching movies. All of these are just consumer products, and we're not really thinking about what we're purchasing. um, I think that idea really held fast for a long time. I'm glad that now we're challenging that and we're understanding that people do not mindlessly just sometimes, but it's a lot more complicated than that. People have very intense feelings towards the art that they consume and the art that they purchase. And just because something is created as a commodity, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't have deeper meaning, not only for the people who are creating it, but for the people who are purchasing it. And that's actually why I really try in my work to focus on music and popular culture that is part of the mainstream, that is easily accessible. Because I've read a lot of excellent works about, fringe cultures and, music that comes from, it's very independent, or it's created, it's very local, it's very regional. And that is very important too, and very interesting. But I think it's operating on a different scale. I'm really interested in interrogating like what cultural products that were created as products are created to profit, usually larger corporations, sometimes smaller labels, as we've seen with early rock and roll, but what that can mean to people, even though it's meant as a consumer product.
Okay. Well, do you find that with your emphasis on popular music and popular culture, a couple of different questions. One, does it help you engage students that you're working with? Uh,
Oh, yeah. Yes.
yeah. And so do you create this dynamic in your class with your work? You bring your work into class, um, and so the students, despite the fact that this is a long time ago now with Elvis and all this bunch, do they get into it?
Oh, 100%. So I actually do teach a course that specifically looks at popular culture, but mostly popular music and social movements between the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War. And also, I just sort of bring in music and popular culture to my other classes as well. And it never fails to amaze me that even music that is created in the 1950s, 60s, which is, quite a while ago at this point, even if students haven't heard of it before, they get involved in it. They like some songs, they don't like others. They tend to still be fans of Elvis and the Beatles and Chuck Berry, like some of these classics of early rock and roll. Not so much of like, skiffle. Okay, that's fair. But like, they definitely get into like the ways that people are performing and the ways that they're, because especially by the 1950s, people are just getting used to performing for television cameras on a regular basis. So I think that that's something that students are really aware of too. It's sort of like that it's a little bit awkward the way that people are performing, and they really get excited about, I hate to use this term because I'm very critical of it in my work, but the authenticity of it. Like they can tell, this is even though performances are being made for record labels, that there's still this element of like performing for an audience and not being too polished, per se. But they definitely get into it. I've really found that playing music, playing videos for students, even the ones who are a little bit disengaged, like it gets them thinking. And usually what happens is I'll play a clip and ask them what they think, and they, the responses start off very surface level. They'll sort of just like point out things that they hear, things that they see, but that's a really important opening to like, okay, well, what does this mean? How is this making us feel? Why do you think this would have been appealing, and who would it have appealed to? And I find it a lot easier to make connections to the historical periods that we're looking at. Just a couple weeks ago, the class that I teach with some of my colleagues in the Honors College, which is on history of Detroit, we were talking about Motown and, playing some Motown videos, looking at some photos of the amazing outfits and everything like that. And yeah, like the students are getting into it. They've heard a lot of these songs before. They've even seen some of the performers before. It's not like it's something brand new to them, but you start asking them questions about like, how is this dispelling stereotypes? Or, how can we sort of look at this as like almost an assembly line of production? Like, it's not an accident that Barry Gordy worked in an automotive industry before he was creating, boy bands and girl bands in sort of the same fashion. So I really find like almost every student is going to at least like be a little bit more engaged. And usually they start off with those sort of surface level responses, and then it guides them to those deeper connections that we're looking for.
Okay, and do they bring you into more of their listening habits today? Do they kind of bring?
Oh my goodness, maybe. That is funny because last semester I actually asked them to send me like a video of a musician that was involved in like a social movement or a song that was dealing with some sort of like cause that was important to them, and they're sending them to me, and then I was playing them thinking like, I am playing these without vetting them, this might be an issue, but it was fine. But yeah, like there was one by someone named like Cupcake or something, and I was just like, oh goodness, this is what it means to be old. But like I am introduced to like some new musicians and styles of music that I wouldn't necessarily have been introduced to otherwise.
Sure. Yeah. No, I understand, because we talk about music and stuff, and then we get back into today, and I'm like, whoa. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got students, but now what about colleagues, and not necessarily at Wayne State in your program, but what about colleagues that you run across elsewhere? Because I remember, and maybe it's other reasons, but I don't know, but walking down the halls and people looking at me kind of strange. Oh, that's that popular music kind of guy. Again, it might be something else that they were looking at me for. I'm not sure, but so did you have any success sort of proselytizing and getting your colleagues into music? Popular music is significant in the historical frame.
Oh, that's such a good question. I honestly don't think I've had to do much persuasion for most of the colleagues, both within my institution and outside of it, that I've spoken with, because a lot of people, again, I think a lot more people are working on, areas that are of a little bit more mainstream interest than you would have seen even 20 years ago. So I haven't really had to do much persuasion. Usually people are very interested, take it seriously. I will say this did happen to me a couple months ago. I was at a meeting, so it was an interdepartmental meeting, and I don't even know what department this person was from, but it was not a humanities department. And we were talking about our research areas, and I was telling them about my trip to Nashville, and they just went, oh, that sounds so fun. And I was just like, yeah, but it's work, but so, I mean, there is that level, I think, that this is entertaining. I get a lot of joy out of it. I think you probably get a lot of joy out of it too. And it is fun to learn more about music that you already like, musicians that you already know kind of a lot about. Sometimes I tell my students when we're talking about things like, you're going to leave this class, you're going to know scandals, you're going to know who was married to whom, who got divorced from whom. Like, there is a fun aspect to that. But it's still a lot of work. It takes a lot of interpretive work to make these connections. Like any sort of cultural studies, it's trying to untangle a bunch of connections that are happening all at once and trying to decide how to communicate these things, which can be difficult sometimes. So that's the only, I mean, I'm sure that it's happened before. That's the only recent example that I can recall.
Sure. No, I remember, and just briefly, I remember my first job interview
Yeah.
at a university, and I had a faculty member who came into the introduction meeting late at the boardroom or the board table. And so she finally got a chance to ask a question, and she asked, well, she prefaced it by, well, I've never actually met an Elvis scholar. And I said, no, ma'am. I said, I'm not an Elvis scholar. I'm a historian of the South. And she came back around a couple of questions later. She goes, I never had a chance to meet an Elvis scholar. Now, they actually hired me there. We actually got along really well, and we understood. She understood that I'm not an Elvis scholar. But anyway,
That's good.
yeah. Well, no, I was just wondering if you had some of the same experiences with that type of thing. But I want to get to in terms of with popular music and so forth. Sort of, do you think that sometimes actually, with us as scholars historians who deal with popular music, do you think sometimes that we actually have a more rigorous type of process we have to go through to make our interpretations stick and to convince people that our interpretations are really valid?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think that that's probably, again, a question that you could apply to cultural studies as a whole. Just this idea that, like, we're not just sort of sitting around talking about, like, wow, this song really moves me, like that we are actually performing, like, analysis on these pieces of culture, and that we're viewing them as, again, simultaneous commodities, pieces of art, entities that have a lot of personal importance to people, but also can have structural importance, and can express some of these larger shifts, and can tell us a lot about what's going on within particular cultures at certain points in time. Is it harder? I mean, I don't know, because I've never really done any other kind of scholarship. But I do think that there is a level of, like, I guess just working on my new project, I've recently just started, like, I started working on sort of the cultural analysis part of it, and realized that I had to contextualize it within the history and the theory to sort of show that, yes, I know what I'm talking about, and this is important. And it got to a point where I realized that I had written like 5 pages on that, like single space pages, and I was just like, that is too much. That is not the point. So I almost think that, like, trusting our audiences, or the people who are listening to us, reading us, our students, our colleagues, whomever, to be able to sort of trust that we have that context, and to make some of those connections without our always having to, like, take their hand through it, guide them through it, I suppose. That might be, I wonder if that's the right way of answering your question, but that's sort of a pressure that I felt. Like, I have to show you every single connection, and I have to make sure that I fill in all of these gaps, or else, it's just going to seem like, oh, this music was coming out at this time, and isn't that cool? Isn't that a coincidence? Which is clearly not what's going on.
Right. Sure. No, no. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to ask you, and during your research and then the conceptualizing of the book from the dissertation and all, and I know that you've been to tons of places doing work at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland and the Schaumburg in New York and everything else. Anything that you ran across that surprised you, that really kind of caught your attention?
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that with regards to archival collection, the thing that really struck me right from the beginning is that I thought I had this, like, very cool idea that rock and roll music represented it was like a parallel to the desegregation movements of the 1950s and 60s. And I knew other scholars had made those arguments as well, but I thought that was something that was fairly new. And then you look back and you realize that, no, that was something people recognized right away. And I think back to that Billboard headline that 1956 reflects the desegregation of the charts when, you know, Billboard created the Hot 100 and in quote unquote integrates these different popular music marketing charts. So you've got the R&B chart representing what people in majority Black neighborhoods are buying, and you've got the country music chart representing what people in majority white areas of the South and Southwest are buying. But people across the country are buying these records, and we're just going to integrate them into one chart. That was something that Billboard called out explicitly. That's something that, you know, we read quite a bit about when you look back at early rock and roll stars. A lot of them were asked what they thought about the civil rights movement and how they fit into it, whether they were Black or white. You know, I always love that story of Pat Boone, who's sort of seen as this, like, you know, he was the white pop star that rock and roll stars were rebelling against. And yet even he was asked about, well, what do you think about these civil rights struggles? And he was like, racism is disgusting. We need to fight back against it. Like, this is not anything new. So that was something that really struck me, that it was almost the story that had been maybe kind of acknowledged, but not really brought to the forefront until scholars started looking at it more clearly in the 1990s and early 2000s. So that really surprised me. On the other hand, I think of the oral histories that I conducted for my book with people who grew up during this period listening to this music. And I asked for people who identified as either white or Black. And a lot of what they said was somewhat surprising. So I remember my editorial assistant, who was in charge of like transcribing all of the interviews that I did. And one day she just sent me an email saying like, oh my God, I'm so sick of people saying like, I'm not racist, but then they say something racist. Like that really surprised me, that people who would like respond to a prompt the way it was written, that, you know, clearly I was looking to talk to people about the civil rights movement and talking to people about like integration within song would say things that were pretty clearly racist. So that definitely surprised me. On the other hand, I was also surprised by, you know, people of any racial background, the ways that they looked back at this period as a time when they really felt like there was a lot of love that was going to overcome this hatred and this racism. A lot of people talking about for the first time, they felt like we might actually achieve the dreams of, you know, achieve the promises that the United States had actually put forth, and that we actually might be able to overcome some of the pains of segregation and racism. There seemed to be a lot of hope there that lingered to this day. And again, this was something that I guess I wouldn't have been surprised to get from white participants, but I got from a lot of Black participants as well, which I found surprising. And the last thing I found surprising when I was conducting interviews, the last ones that I was conducting took place during the summer of 2020. And obviously we were all at home because of the pandemic. But that was also the summer after George Floyd was murdered, and we started to see some of the major Black Lives Matter protests. And so many people, again, either Black or white, said like, this is amazing what is happening. This is actually like, there were limits to the civil rights movement. We didn't change everything we wanted to change, but they had a lot of hope, which was really, I appreciated hearing that, because it obviously, you know, summer of 2020 was not an easy time for anyone. But hearing like so many people who were in their, you know, 80s, I interviewed a few people in their early 90s saying that, like, you know, they were sort of disenchanted with some of the failures of the civil rights movement, but now they felt rejuvenated. That was something that was a nice surprise.
Oh, cool. I wanted to ask you because I thought that was one of the more really intriguing aspects of the book, using these interviews of people who grew up during the time. You didn't do this in your dissertation.
No.
And so I was wondering how that process, how'd you get there? I mean, it's a fascinating aspect of your book, actually.
Thank you.
But how did you get there?
Okay, well, the reason I didn't do much of this in my dissertation was because I didn't have the resources to do it. And luckily I was able to I actually got a grant for the Humanities Center and some other grant monies as well that were able to, I was able to hire an assistant that she was the one who, posted to find people who were interested in talking to me, set up the email account, set up my schedule, transcribed everything. That was something that I tried to do in my dissertation, but I mean, you only have limited time, and I was only able to talk to, I think, about 12 people, just because of the limited time abilities. But because I had the assistant working on that for an entire year, she was able to, like, I believe I was ultimately able to talk to over 40 people, which was obviously a lot better. But yeah, the process, because of Zoom, it was actually a lot easier. Yeah, so that was another thing. When I was writing my dissertation, it was like, the early 2010s. Most of these interviews were done via phone, which is just, I appreciated the fact that we could see people and that you could record it very easily. It just made for an easier experience. I actually have to say, though, a lot of interviews were conducted in 2020 after the pandemic started. A lot of people were at home, especially if you were older. There were a lot of dangers. So I think people were a lot more interested in, finding space to talk about a time in their lives when they were happy and reminisce about some of these things. I talked to a few people who actually worked in the music industry or who were musicians, and were, eager to look back on that time in their life. So yeah, that experience was really interesting. It was something very different. It was something that, I was very fortunate to be able to have the resources to undertake.
Yeah. No, again, I thought that was a really big feature in the book, and I'm sure everybody can be excited about that. The because it really is something that is I think I really haven't seen anybody else do that to that extent that you do, that extensive. So no, I thought that was really neat. Now you mentioned just a minute ago briefly on how in the time you're talking to people in terms of everything happening, what was George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and everything else. Um, so how do you how do you take your work? And I know you address this in the concluding chapter. But how do you think your work and your analysis and,
Mhm.
the way that you address all this with popular music from another period, um, how does this really talk to us today in terms of if people are looking at your work as a model, if they
Mhm.
want to do something um, similar,
Mhm.
looking back at, their time period later on.
Mhm.
How does your work speak to them?
Yeah. So are you talking about like other scholars, or are you talking about just in general, like the issues that we face today?
I think both actually. And I'm sorry for
Okay.
the confusing question.
No, it's okay.
I'm thinking, like really like students for one.
Okay.
That basically maybe they get like we said earlier this evening that they get intrigued by the rock and roll music, R&B and stuff,
Mhm.
but then they bring it back to their own music, and your approach and your methodology
Right.
um, for them in terms of dealing with their own music, and then
Yeah.
later with scholars who will come back and look back at like our time right now,
Mhm.
and so yeah. So how does your work speak to them? I think.
Okay, those are two good questions. So with regards to students or anybody else sort of like thinking about how music can express the time period that we're living in, or how we can use music to help us understand our own like responses to political and social shifts. Um, I actually, I'm a little bit torn about that because I spoke to a former producer who said something that really stuck with me. And he said that there's a lot of great overtly political music out there right now. And he mentioned like Childish Gambino. He said Beyonce. I can't remember who else he mentioned, but he said that, oh, Kendrick Lamar. He said it's too cerebral. He said that it's not that sort of catchy, easy to sing along with. Everybody's going to be listening to it in their car. It's not going to be working on people in that sort of subtle way, in the way that music that came out in the 1950s and early to mid 1960s would have worked. And I thought that was so fascinating that I actually bring that up in a lot of my classes, and I ask my students what they think about that, because I don't know. And again, most of the music that I'm looking at is not overtly political. I think that that's sort of a different thing. As much as I love Bob Dylan, I don't really study him because that's a whole different thing. But this idea of like music that is overtly political but is released as pop music, which is what I think this producer that I was talking to was discussing. I think that he might have something there. So it almost makes me think that a lot of music that's released today, people are putting it into two categories, like music that's serious and has something to say, and then the music that is just kind of mindless. And I really, that's sort of like going away from what my argument is. Like, my argument is that even the music that is meant to just be about, it's a love song, or, it's a party song or something like that. Even something like that can tell us a lot about the ways that we live. It can tell us a lot about the ways that we relate to the world. And the fact that, we have political music that is being released as pop music today might be creating sort of a chasm there. I hope that my students in particular, and maybe, students who are thinking along these lines, maybe picking up my book, maybe picking up your book, might be inclined to think a little bit more differently about that. And I don't study today's music, so I don't, I don't really know. But I think that that's going to be true no matter what. So that's sort of how I would view my work, as hopefully having an impact on the ways that people think about music today, and the ways that it can intersect with our political and social lives. With regards to other scholars, honestly, the way that I would answer that question is something that, I really wanted to come out of my book was, what did the civil rights movement accomplish and what were its limits? And that's something that I don't always see in civil rights scholarship. I think it's really important to be able to identify, like, this is what this movement was able to do, and this is what it was, and this is why it was able to accomplish these things. But here are the limits, and here's what some of the backlash to this movement has created as well. I haven't, like I said, it's not that people don't write about these things or talk about these things, but I haven't really seen it put in those terms. And I really would like to see more scholarship, like very specifically analyzing both accomplishments and limitations.
Okay, yeah, sure. When you're in talking there, I was brought to think about how, in terms of with in the 50s and early 60s, with white teenagers listening to Black radio programming and so forth. Do you think that, in a way, and again, it's non-political, stuff, right? It's stuff about love and dating and whatever else, and sometimes a little before that with something other things. But do you think that there was some sort of connection made with these kids listening to, because we with stuff I've done, with basically coming to see themselves in a similar fashion, despite the fact that they're a segregated society, but they're coming to see themselves in a similar fashion, and basically relate to each other in a very different way than what their parents, grandparents, whatever, older brothers and sisters. So I get that from your work too, in a sense. And I remember also that one of the things that you said about my work and your work was that basically, well, he doesn't prove anything really. So, whatever, not that way, but I basically said, not prove anything, but you basically, I think what you said was that this stuff just kind of happened, but I didn't really go into the more direct dynamic. And you were right. You were actually correct. I did not go into the direct dynamic and how that actually changed. It was almost like I said, well, yeah, everything kind of just fell into place, and all these kids all of a sudden just, whatever. But I'm wondering if you think that, because you really, reading your work has really made me think about my work in a different way. And so I've really been excited about that. And that it didn't just fall out of the sky. There actually was a more direct, I think, connection there.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering what you thought about the direct connection, particularly with, and it gets into reception theory and all this other kind of stuff. But, what do we think these kids were thinking about when they were listening to the music of people that were totally different from them, they never had any exposure to in that way? So how do you think that came together?
Right. Well, that is quite a compliment. Thank you so much. But yeah, what really occurred to me, and especially this, I think in the 1950s, when we're actually seeing what's driving decisions by record labels and music journalists and radio stations to like reach out to new audiences. Because before they were quite segmented. R&B music was meant for Black audiences, and pop music was meant for white, like middle class suburban audiences, and country music is meant for white Southern audiences. We know that this was not a decision, and this is sort of my like criticism of this whole argument that popular music is just a commodity. We know that it's been written about time and time again by music executives, record label executives, that the decision to reach out to new audiences was something that came from below. It was not a decision that anybody was willing to make. And in fact, a lot of radio station operators or record label executives were kind of afraid to sort of branch out across racial lines because they knew that that would really offend and upset segregationists and people who believe that there should be a boundary between these things. So what made me sort of think about that was, and I mean, your book is brilliant, and it's been a basis for all of my research, but just what made me think of like, I just kept thinking like it had to be more conscious, this decision for a white kid to request a record that came from an independent label that was Black owned, that was producing R&B music when there was no hint of trying to market to white teenage audiences. It had to be a conscious decision, even though, technically pop music is, meant to be sold to anyone. It's meant to, even though that's technically the case, Black teenagers still had to make a decision to request an Elvis record. And, from your book, I know very well that like Elvis Presley had a huge Black fan base and that, he would perform to, Black audiences. So like, we know that these have to be conscious decisions that are being made. So that's what really made me think that like, these are not kids who are just being swayed by commodities and not thinking about what they want to listen to. These are people who are making very conscious decisions with the realization that like they're living in a highly segregated society. Even kids who are living in northern cities, this is a period when cities are rapidly segregating, and it's a lot less likely that kids in cities like New York, Detroit, Chicago would be going to school with kids of other races. So this is a decision that they're making, and that was sort of like what stuck with me. As we get into the 1960s and as Motown becomes more popular, I don't think this argument holds as much. But when we're looking at the mid 1950s, I really think that like this is coming from below. So this has to be a decision that's being made within this context that's very rigidly segregated.
Well, again, I want to thank you. And I tell you, if the new book for me comes out, you're going to have a really great line there about how, thanks to Beth Fowler, because you really did push me in that direction. So yeah, I love the book. I love the dissertation too, but I'm all excited about it. And I hope we get a chance to work further in the future.
I do too.
Yeah, no, it's been great to connect and everything. And I don't know if anybody wants to ask questions or anything with part of your fan base over there. If anybody has any questions that they want to ask.
I'll ask a question. Hey, Beth, it's Debbie and Steve.
Hi, Debbie. Yeah.
So can you elaborate, please, on what you were just discussing? When you say it's a conscious decision, it was a conscious decision. Did you have also a theory on what the motivation was with that conscious decision?
Yeah, actually, a lot of people that I spoke with actually told me what their motivations were. This was sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to use oral histories, because I found gaps in the archival history. A lot of, so white kids said that they were not happy with like the pop music that was playing on the radio, or that they, their friends were listening to. I got a lot of people saying that like they weren't really big music fans, and then they heard an R&B record, they heard a jazz record, and it just like, something, they really just like viscerally responded to it. So R&B is a lot more dynamic, it's a lot more emotional. You've got the electric guitar, you've got the drums. You've got songs that are written from a more personal point of view to an extent. They're not necessarily written for like a blanket audience. And they're more emotionally, sexually direct. This is something that really relates to what a lot of white teenagers wanted to listen to at the time. So that was a real draw for white kids. For Black kids, the Black respondents that I talked to doing my oral histories, a lot of them said that like, they thought of themselves as teenagers during this period, and they liked the R&B music that was playing on the Black oriented radio stations. Usually they liked it, the best, but that they also enjoyed pop music because, if it's a song about dating, it's a song about cars. These were things that they were more interested in as well, because the economy was better and there was more disposable income available, and more Black kids are going to high school and college, and encountering these teenage experiences that, like Michael was saying, very similar to their white counterparts. So that's making a decision as well. And then somebody who becomes really big like Elvis Presley, he's like a big star. He's someone that is going to appeal to someone regardless of their racial background. And even if he's not being directly sold to Black audiences, they're still going to want to, seek out his records, seek out tickets to his concert.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think Jamie had a question. I saw her hand up.
I do have a question. Thank you so much, both of you, for that really wonderful conversation. It's so great to see the two of you interact, but also to celebrate Beth's work. Beth, I'm wondering if you could comment on the trend for white performers to appropriate Black music. And I'm thinking in particular of Elvis and, Hound Dog and Big Mama Thornton, but then of course, Pat Boone's infamous Tutti Frutti.
Yeah.
And then since you've got John Lennon on the wall back behind you, I'm thinking of the Beatles and their on blues and, that whole, music scene. Could you say how that, it doesn't at all relate to what you were talking about? Are these two things connected?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because when I was writing my dissertation, that was when there was so much talk surrounding Miley Cyrus appropriating, Black culture and twerking and all of that kind of thing. So it was something that was in my mind. This is interesting because you can see people talking about it as early as the 1950s, that Elvis became really popular, not only singing songs that had already been released by Black musicians, but, sort of appropriating the performance styles and the vocal expressions, the clothing, the hairstyle. This is something that Jerry Lee Lewis also, people were talking about with regards to that as well. I don't even know if it's a difference. I feel like musicians still talk about this in a similar way. It's always that, it's fine that we can share musical like characteristics and performing characteristics, but the fact that Elvis became the king of rock and roll while Chuck Berry was sort of second tier, that doesn't sit well with people. Or the fact that like a lot of Black songwriters were still sort of like doing their office jobs day after day while, a white performer sort of takes their song and like becomes incredibly wealthy with it. That's what doesn't sit well with people. And again, I think when we talk about appropriation today, like seriously, that's still the conversation. It's not that, people can't be influenced by each other. It's more who becomes extremely famous and who is able to make money off of this at the expense of someone else. And Ray Charles is someone who talks a lot about that and says that he is, he's happy to work with musicians no matter what. He loves performing with people from, different backgrounds. He himself loves country music, obviously, puts out a record of country music songs. He just says he doesn't like it if, a white musician like is playing his own songs and becomes more famous than he is, or if he's not, his efforts aren't recognized. And actually, that's sort of something that, in my book, I talk a little bit about the Beatles. And this is one reason why they had a really pretty decent Black fan base at first, because when they're interviewed, they're very quick to sort of say, this is true of the Rolling Stones too, like they're quick to identify their influences. It doesn't necessarily like even out that sort of economic playing field by any means, but the fact that like we're going to be very clear about who our influences are and we're going to give credence to them, that's something that's really appreciated. So it's a difficult conversation. Like I don't think there's any real way to untangle all of these things, because people are always going to be influenced by each other. Usually, like I said, most of the musicians who I read about said it was a good thing. It's just, we have to sort of change the structure that we live in that benefits white performers at the expense of Black performers.
I think Stein had a question with the hand up.
Yeah, thank you both for the fascinating insights into this intertwining of music and US American history. And I have two questions. One, how did then the music record labels know records were requested by white teenagers when it was meant for Black audiences, and vice versa? Was that because of certain record stores were known to be in certain neighborhoods, or how did that trickle up that you described? And then B, were there any gender dynamics?
Oh my gosh. Okay. First question. Yeah, you nailed it. It was basically like you would go, there are a few stories of like white kids going into Black neighborhoods because they knew there was a good music store there. And they would specifically go there to purchase records by Black performers. And I actually spoke to a few people who did that. What would happen more commonly, and what actually was behind the Billboard decision to quote unquote desegregate the charts, was you would hear a song probably on the radio, maybe at a friend's house, and then you would go into the record shop in your neighborhood and request it. If the manager, whomever, gets like enough requests, then they would, whoever their distributor is, they would request it. And I actually spoke with somebody who his father was a distributor of jukeboxes. And he said that like he would keep tabs, like the owners of the restaurants or bars or wherever the jukeboxes were, would say, oh, there have been a lot of requests that you put in the new Little Richard record. And he said, my dad didn't even know who Little Richard was, but he'd be like, fine, I'll request the Little Richard record. So that's generally how that would happen in pre-complicated software days. The second question about gender dynamics, it's so funny you asked that, because my new project, as you know, is on gender dynamics. The one thing that I'll say about that, because I didn't really focus much on gender, but the one thing I will say is that a criticism of R&B from like sort of white middle class listeners at the time was that the male performers seemed too feminized, that they used falsetto when they sang, which is something that you can trace back, to Southern blues culture. They dressed more, decadently. They had like sort of frilly collars and bow ties and elaborate hairdos. So that was already, this is already problematic for white middle class listeners on a racial basis, but then it's also sort of disrupting gender expectations as well, because some of the Black performers, the men, seemed a little too feminized. So when Elvis Presley and then ultimately the Beatles and the Rolling Stones start performing in these same manners, both vocally and just sort of on stage, and even, some of their fashion choices, that becomes, now it's a white performer who's emulating Black characteristics, but also sort of, again, challenging those sort of gender dynamics. So something I noticed when I was reading about the British invasion was the the racial concerns were very veiled, but the gender concerns were very much like on the surface. Like there was a lot written about like, wow, these boys look like girls and these men are acting like women. And you know, part of it probably was, I don't do work on this, so I'm not sure, but part of it probably was a reaction against some of these gendered expectations. But part of it was just an emulation of you know, performance characters that came from the Black community. So that was the intersection that I saw. Thanks.
If I can come back to the and dealing with the appropriation thing, and I'm just wondering what you think about in terms of, I mean, we actually have the sort of the blackface model. You go back, you know, to 19th century. But I'm wondering the whole thing with this sort of quote unquote proletarian type of music, both in this country and in Great Britain, where these kids are basically consumers, and they may or may not have aspirations to become stars or performers or whatever, but they do find it very helpful to them to adapt to Black culture and Black music in terms of appropriating style, appropriating dress, appropriating language. But again, what makes it complicated, of course, and more complicated, is the whole thing with commodity and the whole thing with commercialism. But if we separate that just for a minute and see that, is there something else going on here? It's not necessarily just about like Elvis Presley wanting to become Elvis Presley or whatever. It's Elvis Presley wanting to become somebody within his community and non-invisible, right?
Yeah.
So
I love that.
So, yeah. So how do we get to that? Because we're kind of stuck, you know, for the last several decades in this blackface model of appropriation, and I think it works very well in terms of understanding and trying to, you know, penetrate, you know, the whole thing with money and who makes the money, who doesn't. But we're also talking about countless numbers of kids who basically appropriate Black style, and they never make it. They never attempt to make anything except an identity for themselves. So how do we deal with that?
That's really, I mean, I don't know that I have an answer to your question, to be honest, but just as you were talking, it made me think of Grace Elizabeth Hale's book on, bless you, like white teenagers during the 50s and 60s using Black culture as a means of shaping their own identity as something that's separate from their parents, separate from the middle class, something that's more romanticized and different and rebellious. And in some cases, it is rebelling against something specific. It's, you know, a capitalist society, the Vietnam War, you know, and sometimes it literally is just, like you were saying, I want to stand out. I want to be seen as something different. I don't necessarily know how that maps onto identities today, because that's something that's a lot more common, as opposed to 50s and 60s when, you know, a white middle class kid affecting, you know, mannerisms or characteristics that they see, you know, Black performers or, you know, affecting, like, that's something that I think was it was a lot easier to carve out a space for yourself as I'm a different kind of person, or I'm rebelling against what society expects of me. Whereas today, that's become something that's just so firmly entrenched in mainstream culture that I almost wouldn't. I think it's a lot different, to be honest. I don't know how to answer your question, to be honest.
No, I'm just
yeah. I do think it's different, you know, just because cultural expectations themselves have changed to such an extent that sort of appropriation doesn't mark you as rebellious anymore. If anything, it might mark you as part of mainstream culture.
Yeah. Let's see. No, I think it's, you know, we need to work on that together.
I love it.
I have someone that's asking a question, and it's rather long, so I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but I have a question for Beth. Did shared music create a shared reality that could overcome segregated lives? Have we lost the potential to create this shared reality with the rise of so many streaming services in today's fractured music environment? And I think that's what that's the question.
That's a really good question. And no, I can't see any of that on my side, so I don't know. But yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking about when I was working on my project, this idea of a shared identity. I think it's true to an extent. And I think that's something that a lot of them, that's another reason why I wanted to literally talk to people who grew up during this period, because none of the sources that I could find, in archival collections were answering that question. Like, how did you reshape your identity, or how did listening to this music make you think about your own identity in a different way? And that's something that a lot of people did say, that like, yes, I felt like I was part of this like teenage culture that, being interracial was part of what distinguished it from the generation that came before, which again is ironic, because if you live in a city that is rapidly suburbanizing, like your world is becoming a lot more monoracial than before. Yet the culture itself is becoming more integrated. And I will say that it did express like some very shared experiences. Whether the artist is white or black in the 1950s or 60s, they are singing songs about the same things. And again, it tends to be love and heartbreak and driving around with friends and going to parties and all that kind of thing. But this is what is happening in teenagers' lives. And like school, I know I write about this in my book too. Like high school is such a huge part of people's lives, really, for the first time. It's the first time that we have a majority of kids across the racial line going to high school. So it is expressing this sort of shared reality. At the same time, there are some very major differences that especially white kids listening to this music are not going to be cognizant of. So something I talk about in my book is that even though we get songs about high school coming out from both white and black artists and becoming very popular with white and black listeners, the fact that kids are largely going to segregated schools, even if desegregation orders are in place, that's going to affect the kind of education that you receive. I write specifically about black kids who are desegregating white schools, and often are, maybe there are 1, 2, 5 black students in otherwise all white school. Yeah, they're going to high school. They're technically having the same experiences, but, racial dynamics, racist dynamics are going to have a pretty significant impact on how they experience those things. And I talked to someone when I was doing oral histories, a white woman who grew up in Florida, and she said that when her high school desegregated, it became very scary because there were protesters outside the school every day, and she had previously been very involved in school activities, and she was excited to go to school, and it made her very scared. She started like missing school, dropping out of clubs. So even something like that from a white kid's perspective, again, it's the same experience, but going to schools where the racial dynamics are changing, it's going to have a very significant impact. So that question is really at the heart of what I'm trying to uncover, I think, which is that, we can have these shared musical experiences. They can reflect the things that Black and white kids have in common with each other. Especially, I mostly focus on, nominally middle class kids in this book who are sharing these experiences. But the realities of living in a racially segregated, or at least a racially discriminatory society, are going to mean that those experiences can be felt in very different ways. All right, and the second part of the question, I feel like I talked too long about that. What was the second part of the question?
Let me go back and get it again. Hang on. Let's see. Second part of the question: have we lost the potential to create this shared reality with the rise of so many streaming services in today's fractured music environment?
That's a really good question. I even wonder about that myself, because I am very into music, and yet in the past, I want to say maybe 8 years, I'm not wholly aware of new releases and what's really popular. Part of that might be age, but I think part of it really is the fact that the way that music is distributed now, and the way it becomes popular is something that is a lot more siloed than it used to be. Radio stations still kind of play the same playlists. They sort of follow very similar, I think, pretty similar templates to the way that they did in the 1950s and 60s, even though they're much more corporatized. But I think that that's not the way that most people are listening to music anymore. So I wonder about that. And I will say, like, I think that once first of all, the Hot 100 sort of splintered again in the late 1960s, sort of reflecting the fact that Black audiences were moving more towards soul, white audiences were moving more towards, the heavier rock of Led Zeppelin, and I'm blanking because I don't really care for that genre of music, but you sort of see it like splintering again in the late 1960s. And then by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, you get all these different Billboard charts, Latin pop, gospel. I know that there are a bunch, adult contemporary, easy listening, all these different genres. I do wonder about that. I don't think that we've lost that capacity, because I think there still are examples of albums or songs that sort of capture everybody all at once, and everybody sort of relates to them to a certain extent, or at least on a generational level. I know my students all love Lil Nas X. Doesn't matter where they come from, they love him. So I don't think we've lost that ability. It's probably become a lot harder. I mean, even when I was doing content analysis of Billboard charts and looking at every single record that made the top 10 for 10 years, I knew most of those songs, like in today. And I think most people would know most of those songs. I don't think that that's going to be true going forward. And so I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's a lot less likely.
I have a question. Thinking in terms of I'm coming from a naysayer's point of view now, in terms of the music bringing people together with similar types of identities and certain types of activities that they do and everything else. Was that enough? Or was there something else needed in terms of more political action, and not just coming together in terms of the cultural, but the political,
Yes.
and the ideological?
Oh yeah, 100%. And in fact, that's a major problem that I identify in my book. And it's sad because I think that it's something that I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. So basically what I think happened is that because of this shared identity, a large number of white listeners in particular grew up thinking like, oh, we're all the same, and we should all have equal rights. And you see the monumental legislation that's passed in 1964 and 65 that technically is supposed to grant people equal rights. And I think too many people just sort of looked at that as that's it. That's the end. I'm not racist. I want everybody to enjoy equal rights. But so much more political mobilization, I think has been made clear in the past 10, 15 years or so. I think we're living with the legacy not only of unfinished aspects of the civil rights movement, especially with regards to economic advancement, but also a significant backlash. And I think that that's unfortunately often hidden behind, the fact that a lot of people individually were very impacted by this idea that there's this shared identity, which it does exist. I'm not denying that. But I think it's, as you said, like it's a start. It's not the finish line. And I think, unfortunately, and especially I think like the sort of mainstream popular narrative surrounding the civil rights movement is that, yes, we all agreed that racism is wrong, and Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, let's go forward and pretend none of this ever happened. It almost, in its success, sort of precluded further political work that's necessary to finish this movement.
All right, thanks. No, that's great. Yeah. Um, does anyone have any other questions for Beth? Um, one of the questions I was going to ask you in terms of you are so enthusiastic, and again, this is the first time we've met,
Yeah.
but you are so enthusiastic and talking particularly about this topic. And I know that it seems like when you're in the classroom, that I'm sure you bring that enthusiasm with you and it carries over with your class. Um, I am fairly certain that your book is going to be adopted in numerous types of classes across, the world, but in terms of history classes and music classes and so forth. Um, so just sort of how is your book going to do in those classes without you?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question. I was actually thinking like maybe you have some insight here because part of me thinks like I'm very excited for, instructors and students in other classrooms to think about some of the things that are in my book and some of the things that I found and dissect them on their own terms. But also, again, sort of coming back the difficulty of cultural studies, you almost feel like you have to over explain everything. And
Yeah.
if you're not there to over explain it, like they're going to miss something that I wrote. So I guess I do have that sort of like, because you're trying to say so many things at once. Are they going to really get the actual pictures? I don't know. Like that was actually a question I have for you too, if that's something that you can ever quite get over.
No, I don't think I can, but I think maybe you could get some invitations wrangled that you can go speak to these classes all over the place. That would be great.
I guess that's the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that would work.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So is there anything you want to add, Beth, in terms of anything about the book? I think it's a great book and I think it's going to do really well with readers everywhere, but anything you want to add to it?
I don't think so. I appreciate everybody coming out tonight. I know it's a little bit later, so I thank you everybody for coming out to talk. Thank you, Michael, so much. I mean, it's just been an honor to talk to you. Like your book, I still read it for pretty much, I go back to it consistently. Like it is one of the best pieces of scholarship in the field, definitely by any stretch of the imagination. It's something that I consistently find new things to think about in, and I look forward to your new book as well. And I look forward to the conversations that we're going to continue to have.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too, Beth, and thank you. I appreciate the comments, but no, I really, your book blew me away. So
you.
I'm excited about that. I do
Thanks.
think that maybe Eckert had a question. I saw a hand, maybe. Is that Stein?
No, I was just having a little celebration symbol to celebrate
okay.
your books
Yeah.
and this wonderful book launch. So yeah, thank you everyone for making this happen.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you to the Humanities Center as well. I appreciate all of your support over the years.
You actually had some comments. Susie wanted to say that she really enjoyed it. It was great, and she had to leave a little while ago, but she really loved it. So, and again, Nicole, well done. Thank you for a very thoughtful conversation tonight. So she was excited as well.
Oh, thank you so much. I so appreciate everybody's efforts in making this come together.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. It's really been fun for me to be up here with you and all that.
Yeah.
I look forward to the next book.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to your book as well. So we'll hopefully keep this conversation going.
I hope so. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.